Today I am going to show you how to paint with oil paint without overblending and creating a muddy mess. The model for today's painting is my racing noodle, Gibson, if I can get him to hold still for a minute. To paint my elegant hound, I have chosen to work on a Frederick's Belgian linen canvas. This video is sponsored by Frederick's. If you are supporters over on Patreon, make sure to head over where you have almost 4 hours for this lesson there. If you are unfamiliar with Patreon, for as little as $4 a month, you get access to all of my longer 1 to 2 hour, sometimes 4 hour long tutorials. I have over 200 of them that you can watch right now as soon as you sign up. If you're not sure if Patreon is going to be a fit for you, I do have a free video that you can watch over on my website along with my video library, so you can see everything that I have there. The link is in the video description. To start with, I drew everything out with a regular graphite pencil. That was a 4H graphite, and drew it directly onto the canvas. I'm painting everything in just sepia tones in my raw umber, and I think I've used a little bit of black, some unbleached titanium white is in there, and I'm going to just block out my general lights and darks. I'm not worrying about color at all here. Everything is being kept monotone. And this is going to make it much easier for me, the entire painting really. I'm separating the challenge of getting the colors I want from the challenge of just getting everything generally mapped out. Where are my lights and my darks? So by doing this, my job is so much easier. Now I went with the Frederick's Belgian linen canvas because it is so smooth and I have a lot of details that I want to do on this. So getting those finer details, getting the very smooth blending is going to be much easier on a very, very smooth canvas. The paint just glides across it. Now this was part of the live stream, so you can watch this section in real time to see how I'm doing all of this. I believe my palette was shown on the live stream as well, and then the palette of course is always shown over on Patreon too, if that's something that you think will help you to learn to paint better. So now I'm going to go ahead and start blocking in some of these darker areas. I've mixed my black in with some of my raw umber. And I don't need everything perfect. Close is good enough at this stage. Now, I do recommend start with an accurate drawing. Do not start painting until you've got your drawing looking how you want it to. A lot of times people think, well, I'll just fix that once I start painting. If you're very advanced, absolutely not a problem. But for most artists, as they're getting started, that's going to make your life way more difficult and it's much harder to fix. Fix it first when you've got a pencil and an eraser where you can make all of those adjustments. Now, a lot of people are kind of afraid to paint black dogs or cats or animals because you can't see a whole lot of detail. That all comes down to the photo and the way that you set up your photo. So for this photo shoot with him, I put him in an area where he was getting sunlight coming through the window. It works better early morning, late afternoon, depending on where you're located. The sun's position is going to make a big difference. And it works better if the sun is one side or the other versus straight up in the middle of the sky. I find that I can get better contrast where the lights and the darks are. But as you can see in this painting, there are definite lights and darks. I actually had to tone my reference photo down a lot because his coat is so shiny. The whites in there, which was just shiny black fur, were so bright. But it gave me what I needed to be able to see to create a painting that was more three-dimensional, that had more depth, that wasn't just a flat black outline. Otherwise, you just look like a silhouette with eyes. So getting a good reference photo really makes a difference. You want to avoid photos where the dog is just sitting on the couch across the room and, in artificial lighting, that sort of thing. Avoid that. That usually is not going to give you the best look, and especially on a dog with a coat this dark. The lighting really does matter, so you may just have to play around with different locations of where that dog is positioned to get the best light source. But direct sunlight is definitely the way to go. I've gotten the best results that way, much, much more so than artificial lighting. Now, all of this is being done on the day one. I'm going to do my base layer on him and on the background. Nothing has to be perfect. I can do touch-ups and such later, but I do want to make sure certain things are really close to being perfect. I want the ears in the right location, the eyes, the nose, the outline. That I do want to keep pretty close. Everything else I can adjust a bit. Also, be careful when you're adding highlights, and especially something like this where the highlights are so well defined. Don't start making them up as you go along. Those highlights determine the underlying bone and muscular structure of the animal. So you don't want to just, if you've got a photo that you can't see the highlights, don't just start putting them anywhere thinking that will look good, because it won't. You can make the animal look very, very deformed in the end. So just building up the general location of where his fur is. Now watch on animals with super short fur, whether it be horses, dogs, any animal that has really short fur. Don't try to force in each individual strand of fur. You'll make him look wiry and kind of scraggly. That isn't the look you want to go with here. I will give the hint of fur as we get going a little bit more in a few locations where his coat is a little bit longer. But if the fur is super short, don't try to force in marks, little fur marks. It won't look right. And I've seen people do that a lot where they think more detail will look more realistic. Well, no, not if the detail's inaccurate. If it doesn't call for hair, if you don't want thick lines of hair, it's not going to look right there. Now, I am a huge fan of using black paint. I'm sure you've heard artists who hate using black paint. The thought process there is that it can make the work look very flat, and I do agree with that. However, if you mix it with other colors, or in my case, I'm going to be glazing color on top of it, I love the look that I get. And the black paint that I use for oils, it's Weber's Permalba. I use their black and their titanium white. I'm not a huge fan of their other paints that I've used. They have a very odd smell to them. They actually perform fine, but the paint, the greens, yellows, I think I've got some red. I forget what all colors I have. They have the oddest smell that I really do not like. And I'm a fan of the smell of oil paint. These are very odd, but I love the Weber's Permalba black and white paint. Now I use a mop brush to fan that out, just to blur out that background, and I'm going to let that dry overnight. Now, I use Winsor & Newton liquid. That is my mixing medium. You hear people use linseed oil or walnut oil. There's tons of different oil mixing mediums you can use. The Winsor & Newton liquid is by far my favorite. It dries usually, because I paint in such thin layers, it'll generally dry overnight. So this is ready for me to go on to my next layer the next day. And I'm fairly impatient, so it's a really good fit for me. Now we are on to my second day, and I'm still working with just the brown, white, and black colors, and starting to clean up my details, starting to define things a bit better. So my first day, things tend to be a bit fuzzy. That's okay. This is the day that we can start cleaning things up. And that's going to be the biggest thing. And I'll mention this a few times throughout this video, but the problem that a lot of people have with oil paints is they will overblend things because they stay wet. It's really easy to blend. It's wonderful. But it's really easy to blend, and people will take that a bit too far. Instead of making maybe 2-3 brush strokes to blend an area, they'll make 30 brush strokes. They think, well, if it looked good with 2 brush strokes, it must look amazing if I do more. And if you overblend, you lose your definition, you lose the light and dark, and you create mud. The trick with oil painting is knowing and figuring out when to stop and let it dry. If you start creating mud, if you start having a problem where things are just mushing together and blending too much, that's your signal. That right there tells you stop. Let it dry, come back the next day or 2 weeks later if you're using linseed oil or something that dries slower. But if you can learn when to let it dry, oils are one of the easier mediums, I think, to learn. It's definitely one of the easiest mediums I have found as far as teaching goes. The big trick is just getting students to understand when you want to stop and let that dry. So working on my contrast a bit more, you can see I'm getting my darks really dark in here. Very, very high contrast in this painting. And the brush that I'm using there is a synthetic hog-haired liner brush that I believe is a number 2. Now everything that I painted the previous day is completely dry, so as I add another layer, if something doesn't look right, all I have to do is take my paper towel and wipe it off and try it again. Very forgiving. Now you do need that previous layer to be completely dry. The type of paint that you're using will make a difference as well. I've had students that had brought in some Bob Ross oil paints. Now Bob Ross oil paints, I'm not saying they're bad, but they're meant for a different technique, a different way of painting, for wet into wet and building thicker layers. Here, that won't work, because when the previous layer had dried, when students would put the next layer over, it kind of reactivated the first layer, and sometimes that would pull up. So the way that I'm painting here, I want a paint that is going to dry completely and be permanent and not reactivate, not lift again. And all of the supplies that I'm using are listed in the video description. So here we are on to our next day. This is for painting the color, starting to get that in there. And this is, again, part of the live stream. So this section you can watch, and I'll have links to those live streams in the description, but you can watch those and see in real time how I'm layering these in here. Now he is a black dog, but I'm going to be using a lot of magenta. I've got some brown. I'll be using blue. I'm not using a whole lot of black. The black was for my deepest shadows, but black is going to be very reflective of what is around him. And this painting being for me, I really wanted to play up the colors that it would pick up. So I definitely oversaturated some of those colors to get this look. But don't limit yourself when you're painting an animal who has black fur. Don't limit yourself to just black. You will end up with something that looks very flat. And I've got some reddish browns, using a lot of that magenta. And that poofy brush you're seeing me use, it's just a mop brush, and that's what I'm using to get that soft, just kind of blending things out there. So I apply the paint with one brush, and then I use that mop brush to soften the transition between that and the paint that's next to it. That really is only going to work for wet into wet. If you're blending an area that's wet into an area that's dry, I'm going to switch to a more stiff brush. Get the first layer for the background here. Using several tones of greens. Got some blues in there. At one point, I thought red would look really good. It didn't. It looked absolutely terrible. Was not what I was going for. It wasn't a big deal though, because I was able to just wipe that area off and paint right over it. Here's the red that I thought might be good. No, it is not. You can see I took the paper towel there, removed it. There was some of that brighter aqua color in there. Got some yellow. Now this doesn't have to be finished, it's just a base layer. Now I'm going to go ahead and let that dry overnight, and then I can come back the next day and paint again. So now I'm mixing some indigo in with my violet or magenta color. So I'm getting more of it. Those colors together, they mix something that is very similar to a dioxazine purple, which is really what I wanted. I was just too lazy to go get the dioxazine purple, and I had the indigo out, so I figured I'd just mix it. I'm using a lot of transparent mixing white as I get some of these highlights in here. I'm sorry, it's not transparent mixing white. That's what it's called with acrylics. With oils, I'm using zinc white, which works very similar to the transparent mixing white. Now be careful with zinc white. Zinc white, if you paint it thick, it is notorious for cracking. So when I use it, it's in very thin layers. I'm not painting big, thick chunks. And I don't paint with oil paints thick anyway. Everything is a thin layer from start to finish. So it's never been a problem for me, but you don't want to use zinc white and cake that on there. And it has more, it's got a bluish tint to it, and it is more translucent than your more opaque titanium white. Go ahead and get another layer on the background here, darkening up the edges to help keep the focus on Gibson. You see me use Q-tips a lot, or if you're not in the US, I think you guys call them cotton swabs. Q-tips a brand name, but I use those a lot for wiping areas where I either got a little crazy with the brush, went out of the area I wanted, or if I just want to lighten an area. It's a really good technique to remove paint to pull highlights back in. And as I go, I just keep refining details more and more. You can see I'm getting the hint of fur now, just in a few places. This is where you don't want to go crazy, putting marks of fur everywhere. Now that layer dried completely, and I'm going to go ahead and start going over. I'm using indigo to darken up my background a lot, leaving the area around his face a bit lighter. And just like I keep mentioning, letting that dry and then coming back in. I don't deal with muddy colors at all. It's never a problem. You just have to be patient and make sure you do let that dry where it needs to. Using more of that zinc white, getting some highlights in there. Again, not too thick. Now, I am paying attention, even though the fur is very short, I'm still paying attention to which direction the fur goes in. So if I do have any brush strokes, they are going in the direction that the fur is growing in. Got that shine on his eye. And as I get to these stages, I start not depending on my reference photo so much. I start backing away from my painting and deciding what will make my painting look better. Should I make something a little darker, a little lighter? And this one is going on my own wall, so I really get to follow my rule when I'm painting, when I know things are done, is if I am going to be happy with it hanging on my wall as it is. And being that this one is actually going on my wall, that made that little exercise pretty easy. But I look at it as, if I walk by this, is something going to stand out and I'm going to wish I had changed it? That's when I know something is done, when I no longer see things that I just think I'll wish I had changed if it were hanging on my own wall. Some whiskers in there, a little bit more detail on his nose. Depending on how much liquid you're using in any given area, you're going to have areas that are shinier than other areas. The solution to that is when you varnish it, use a gloss varnish, and that will even everything out beautifully. I use a varnish by Gamblin. It's called Gambar, and it is amazing. You're able to go ahead and put your varnish on as soon as the painting is dry to the touch, whereas most oil painting varnishes require that the painting be dry for 6 months before you varnish. This product is just a godsend. It's one I can't live without. It's a must-have for me with oil painting. I love this stuff. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. But that will even out the gloss to the entire painting. It makes everything look like the whole painting is wet again, versus the areas that start to look a little bit more dull. It really pulls the colors out nicely too. Using a bit of aqua to go around the edges. Not because that is at all in my reference photo, just because it's a look that I like. I think it looks really nice. And I'm not outlining everything. It's just here and there, a few touches of that aqua color. I don't want you to look at it and go, wow, that's blue. It should be very subtle. Remember, your reference photo is a guideline. It's going to help you to understand the shape and structure of your subject, but don't feel like every single thing has to be exact to that reference photo. You're an artist. You're going to take some artistic liberties and change things that you think will make the work look better. A little bit more on those whiskers. And that is it for my first painting of my Greyhound Gibson. And as you can see, if you just stop and let your painting dry in between layers, you are not going to run into that problem of creating that muddy mess that oils are notorious for. It really just comes down to stop, let it dry, and then go on to the next layer the next day. Well, the next day if you're using liquid, longer if you're using a different mixing medium. So this last week, Gibson has decided that he wants to sleep in my bed with me, or more accurately, in my bed on me. He was very smart in how he manipulated me into allowing this. He'd start by only putting his front legs on the bed, and then he'd kind of slide his chest on and just lay on top of my leg like that, like, I'm just gonna lay here, I'm the sweetest boy ever, you can't tell me no, look how sweet I am, but my back legs are still on the floor, so I'm not really on your bed, right? Yeah. That didn't last long. It soon turned into this. But how can you say no to that face? Apparently, I am not able to. Although now every time I get anywhere near the bed, he thinks that means he should get in it, including when I'm trying to make it. It is really hard to make a bed with a 65-pound Greyhound in it. I walked away and he followed me, so I ran back really quick to finish making it, and he jumped on before I could completely finish folding the blanket. So that's as far as I got today in making my bed. Thanks, Gibson. You're a real help. Have you subscribed yet? If not, I have a handy button right there. It's round, has an orange arrow going towards it. If you click on that, that'll help you to keep up to date with all of my new art videos every single week.